change tack a little bit and talk a little bit about your time in ICANN, being on the expert working group dealing with WHOIS and related things. In my time at large, I've been finding that there's a lot of conflict going on between the privacy needs of people who buy domain names and that kind of thing, and people in law enforcement on the other side who are saying we don't want to be scammed, we don't want to be spammed. And so you have, in some cases, entire industries where you have people that register a domain, do something bad, get rid of the domain, and then move on to something else. And the task of tracking that down becomes either enormous or impossible in some places where the WHOIS data just doesn't exist and the registrar is uncooperative. How do you balance that with the need for privacy in WHOIS? How do you balance the needs of end users who are scared of being scammed with the need of some people who register domains of the desire to be anonymous? How does that balance?
This is a really complex problem, and certainly one that we grappled with a lot on the expert working group, where I am the supposed privacy expert sitting on that group. And I have a particular hobby horse with respect to ICANN that I'm riding, and bear with me while I talk about it for a second. When you're in government, and I spent 35 years, depending on how you count, in government, there's a fairly well-known system in Europe and in North America called the Regulatory Impact Assessment, WHOIS. And whenever you make a change in law or regulation, you do pretty exhaustive impact assessment. Okay, what's this going to do to small business? What's it going to do to this industry? What's it going to do to the disabled? What's it going to do to language minorities? What about people who can't read? You know, all of those things, so that you make sure that you're not having a disproportionate impact on one sector or another. I would say, and I've only been working in the ICANN committees for the last year, basically, but I would say that's something that would really help ICANN, because it's a multi-stakeholder organization, but lots of stakeholders aren't represented there. And that would be as if an industry association came up with something. It would work for their industry, but it's not necessarily going to work for the people who aren't represented there. So to get back to your precise question on this one, there is a desire to have completely accurate data and to put a load on the registrars to get that accurate data. My feeling is, if you've got a real scammer who's running, either just trying to get identity information, or who is operating a scam, or who is selling illegal, illicit pharma, you're not going to find them again. If they have to have accurate data, if they can't register a domain name under Mickey Mouse, then they're going to steal Joe Consumer's data to register it. They're going to find an accurate address and a phone number that works, and unless you put a huge load on the registrars to check these people out, as we have done on banks, for instance, in Western societies, they have to check somebody out to make sure they're legitimate before they open a bank account. But registering a domain name is not quite the same issue, and there isn't the infrastructure, unless we're going to drive the cost of domain services way up, to look after that. And I would argue that, particularly with the kind of scams that go on the internet, you can register in one place, sell in another where you have no presence, do something else in the third jurisdiction. Right. They're not going to get them. So this is the kind of thing you would uncover in a regulatory impact assessment. You're putting a huge burden on the registrars. It won't catch the bad guy. It sounds like it might work, but they're ahead of the game anyway. So, and one thing we have to worry about, one of the reasons I would suggest that we have less identity theft than we actually do on the internet, is the data isn't good enough. The minute you start asking accurate data, well, boy, that's a real treasure trove of data for other purposes.
So you're saying that the alternative is either no data, bad data, or stolen data?
That's maybe an oversimplification. I do think we have to clean up some of the data, but you can't take away the right to protect your personal address and your personal data from small business people, for instance.
Right.
And that's something, it's so interesting when you look at internet scholarship, especially if you're my age and you were around when the internet kind of went public. the change has been so rapid. We don't even conceptualize what the internet is, I think, accurately. We don't keep up with how it's changing. It's now where government almost exclusively wants to deal with their citizens over the internet. Annual reports that are a requirement to feed into domestic parliaments, they're all done electronically now. Good luck if you don't have internet access. Most of us do, thank goodness, in this jurisdiction. Not so in other jurisdictions. Globally, everybody's on now, to varying degrees, but the cultural ethos of how they're on and how they get on and what they have to pay for it and how they're accessing things is totally different. We need to factor all those things in. I'm going off on a tangent here.
Right.
But so anytime you make a change in it to get the bad guys, you got to
Right.
figure out how this works. I have some sympathy for government, obviously, having worked in government a long time. The problem of how to catch the bad guys in a global society, where, normally for criminal matters we use these things called MLATs, Mutual Legal Assistance Treaties. Internet fraud happens so quickly. We don't necessarily have mutual legal assistance treaties through all the different countries that a perpetrator is going to be acting. This stuff is hard, but I don't think we've got it figured out yet.
But it sounds like you're getting to a fundamental problem with even the way this is done within ICANN, in that can you have the kind of discussion that you're talking about in a body such as ICANN, which in effect provides some regulatory functions but refuses to call itself a regulator. And even when they do their regulations, it's through contracts as opposed to anything in terms of regulations or frameworks or things like that. Is ICANN even the right place to have that discussion?
Well, that's a very good question, and of course we've got a huge debate going on about internet governance and who should do it right now. The fact is, intergovernmental bodies probably move slower than ICANN does. ICANN, for all of its faults, has kept up with this tremendous pace in internet expansion. That's a non-trivial exercise, and so has its sister organization, the Internet Engineering Task Force. I mean, the fact that these bodies in the multi-stakeholder role have been able to keep up and do things makes me somewhat tolerant of the fact that they don't seem to know what policy is when they're doing it. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that is really affects policy that happens when we implement something through these structures and organizations. It's not that they're not aware of it, it's just somebody has to do it and get on with it.
So what is your take on right now of what seems to be at one point having some governments through the ITU that are saying we want to do the internet this way, and then you have ICANN and you have the IETF through the Internet Society and other bodies that are saying we need to preserve multi-stakeholder. Is this going to become sort of a winner-takes-all battle, or is there, how do you see this playing out?
Well, and you've been at this longer than I have, so you'd be the better person to stake our bets here. My own view is I think it's impressive what has been done through multi-stakeholderism. I'm convinced that civil society has to have a role to play. I've worked in standards organizations, standards setting bodies, where sometimes there's more effort to get the consumer voice and the civil society voice in there in a matrixed format, but not always. It depends on the standards development body, and it depends on the institution. So I like the fact that civil society can play a role. It's underrepresented, they don't have the funding, there are many sort of structural impediments, but at least they're at the table. They're not at the table at many government organizations. I'm familiar with the ITU and the OECD, and they try to get the civil society role in there, but they're not full players, whereas they are full players at ICANN, and certainly they can participate in the ITF as well. So I like the model. But at the same time, there are some things that have to be done by governments. So, for instance, criminal law enforcement. I don't really think it's ICANN's job to figure out how to do criminal law enforcement and to mandate the private sector to do it. That's for governments, So there needs to be the lines clearly drawn between what's a government responsibility and what's a multi-stakeholder, cooperating,
Right.
not-for-profit.
So that's a challenge going on right now, I guess, between ICANN and the governments.
Right, right. I mean, we were talking about the fraudsters a while ago. You've got to figure out how to do that legally, because this will arise as a major competitive issue. If you start, for instance, you have to take down malware. What happens if you take down the wrong company by mistake? If some anti-competitive force gets in there and gets you on a spam list or plants their own, how do you control that kind of behavior as we move towards a global information marketplace? I think we're just starting to see some regulatory action on that. Canada is busy working on spam remedies right now, so I'm only looking at what Canada is doing. It's very uneven around the world who's legislated on spam and who hasn't. But I mean, that's a matter that has to be sorted by governments. And if they don't do it, well, then we're going to have anti-competitive behavior, which falls squarely in their court.
Okay. Last, how would you categorize Canada's position in how well its citizens are protected compared to what you see going on elsewhere in the world? It sounds like we're a little bit behind some of the Europeans, but ahead of some others. Or do I have it wrong? How well are we doing?
Well, the old saying, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The real question, we have some law, and it's not terrible law. I'm biased because I worked on it. The Europeans have more complete law, but ultimately at the end of the day you have to see how the law is enforced. You can have the law in the books, none of the companies are aware of it, they're not enforcing it, what good does it do? None of the citizens are aware of it. So it's really, can you go out onto the street out there and ask people what they know, and can they pass a 20-question test? And we don't do much of that. So I think that's really, we're kind of, if you're talking about a maturity level, we're on the bottom rung. We've got the legislation in place. Most Canadians are probably unaware that they're protected. Very few of them request their data so that they're not aware of what's happening to their data. There's a very limited amount of headspace that people have for privacy matters. If it's not biting them, they're not going to pay attention because they've got all these other things. They've got to make ends meet. They've got to deal with credit. They've got to wonder whether their water's pure. They've got to wonder about the quality of their kids' education, their retirement plan, you name it. There's a whole big list, so you can only take that much of their information space. Now, there's a focus on privacy right now. So I understand it was the word of the year last year. So this is an opportunity to get people to at least ask questions about it and what it means to them. And then maybe we'll knock up another rung on the maturity level, and maybe we'll tweak our bills and bring them up to date. People aren't aware of this, but the Privacy Act in Canada was passed in 82, and we haven't amended it really in the ensuing years. That's the one that covers government.
Right.
And it needs a little bit of revision, That was before we had computers on the desk. So that could use a little work, and most of the provinces are in the same shape. They finally brought in data protection for governments and municipalities, but most of those bills need a relook in the computer age. So there's some really fundamental questions getting back to the whole nature of the internet and ICANN and what it's regulating in the global society that we haven't looked at, and that's what I'm interested in studying, is what's changing. How do we ethically treat human beings in a global society, not just citizens, because we're all moving now, we're all mobile. So our information often precedes us. How do we treat people fairly based on the profile that a given organization, company, airline, you name it, educational institution, all of that stuff has to be sorted at the international level. And ICANN can play a role in that insofar as it works on the domain space. But I think ICANN has a policy role because it understands government to speak more broadly on policy matters. They probably don't see that. But it's up to the people who understand how the internet works to talk more about it, I think.